Welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist on Facebook Live, where we answer common questions about atheism, freethinkers, and the separation between religion and government. I'm Annie Laurie Gaylor, co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces this weekly show.
And I'm Liz Cavell, a constitutional attorney here at FFRF. Today we are going to get international. We're going to have a guest you know well, Skyping in from a Free Thought conference happening right now in Honduras. And I'm also going to chat with Annie Laurie about a conference she spoke at last week in London called the International Conference on Sharia, Segregation and Secularism. It was in London, organized by FFRF friend and awardee Miriam Namazi. And I'll be asking Annie Laurie and our guests some questions about their respective international conferences. But if you've got questions, please ask them in the comments below, or you can email askanatheist@ffrf.org, and we'll try to get to them.
So first, let's see if we can bring on our guest from Honduras, and he's none other than Dan Barker, the co-president of FFRF, who happens to be my husband, and he happens to be in Honduras for a national free-thinking conference starting in just a few hours. And he's going to be giving the opening keynote on the topic of the importance of critical thinking, but of course in Spanish. So Dan, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes. And who's with you?
And Olvin is here, the main organizer of the Honduran Freethinkers. He drove down from Tegucigalpa, the national capital, down to where we are in San Pedro Sula, which is more to the north by the Gulf of Mexico. So, and I met Olvin last year when we had that big conference there in Tegucigalpa.
So which one of you wants to tell us more about the conference?
Well, first of all, I want to ask you, what's the weather like there in Madison right now?
I was just thinking,
about,
Dan,
what,
you
32
look very
degrees?
warm.
Yes. Cold, but to be expected.
We're in the mid-80s here, you can tell. And tomorrow we're going to go swimming in the Gulf of Mexico.
Okay.
I think that was a setup question.
Just tell us about the conference, Dan. Stick to the conference. What's going on down there?
What's that?
Tell us about what's going on down there. Tell us about this conference.
Okay. So the Honduran freethinkers are based all over the country, and they have acquired the Universidad. Today and through the week, they're going to be having meetings about the importance of free thought. There are speakers from other countries. Besides me, there's a speaker, Ferne, from Colombia. And it's mostly young people, they tell me. Más jóvenes.
Claro, este es un país eminentemente joven.
He says this is a very young country, so the freethinkers, well, not just freethinkers, but almost everybody here is young people.
And is this the second or third conference in Honduras?
Es la segunda conferencia en Honduras.
Segunda conferencia internacional.
It's the second international conference in Honduras.
Sí, en esta ocasión esta es la segunda ciudad más grande, Big City, de Honduras. Y estamos muy contentos, avanza la lucha y es bien importante.
He said this is the second largest city in the country. It's very important to advance free thought. They're very happy that we're able to put on events like this to fight, para luchar contra la iglesia, ¿verdad?
Las iglesias han llegado al extremo de querer hacer un partido político cuando es prohibido por la ley.
So they're fighting right now. There's a law in Honduras that ministers can't serve in the government, but they're trying to change that law because the ministers want more influence in the government. When they realize their power is dwindling in the church, they want to have more governmental power. So that's one of the themes we're talking about here.
And what are some of the other problems with religion and government in Honduras?
There's another person here. Let me turn it around. If you can see Cesar, can you see Cesar there?
Ah, hola.
Hello, how are you?
Cesar is a Honduran. He's one of the organizers, and he speaks some English, right? So yeah. She's asking, what are some of the other problems in Honduras besides what we just mentioned?
For example, we have a very big problem with teaching of the Bible in public schools. that shouldn't be done because it's a state-funded schools. They shouldn't be teaching the Bible.
Teaching the Bible.
We're trying to fight against that.
Can you hear him okay?
Yes,
Yes.
and also
Okay.
I don't think the Bible is it's really X-rated. Is it really appropriate to introduce it to small children?
Y ella dice que la Biblia no se debe introducir a los niños tan pequeños porque tiene tantos problemas en la Biblia. Yeah?
Sí.
Yeah, they agree.
And how many
Querer modificar las leyes porque están en el
Yeah?
how many Hondurans are not religious? Do they know?
¿Quieres saber cuántos hondureños no son religiosos?
Honduras es el quinto país
¿Eh?
más descreyente de toda América Latina.
It's the fifth largest country of believers in all Latin America. ¿Y no creyentes?
O sea, las estadísticas nunca se hacen en que si es ateo o no es ateo, sino en la confianza en la religión o si es religiosa o no. Entonces sería descreyentes en la religión.
Y tiene una proporción.
22%.
So about 22% of Hondurans say they do not practice religion. They don't ask
Wow.
if they're atheists.
Well, that's just
So
like
it's
the
a
United
pretty-
States.
Yeah, that's a big number.
Yeah.
Dice que es similar a los Estados Unidos, porcentaje.
Es similar, pero nuestros países vecinos tienen diferencias bien grandes, entonces a veces se pierde esa perspectiva. Y me parece importante que les diga que la fuente es Latinobarómetro, está en internet para que no es que nos lo estamos inventando.
Yeah. So each country has its own different wrinkles, its own different types of problems with the state church, he says. But they're happy to be promoting free thought.
So before we sign off, could they talk a little bit about the status of women in Honduras, reproductive rights?
¿Quieres saber de las mujeres en Honduras, los derechos de reproducción?
Nosotros en Honduras es de los pocos países en el mundo, en Latinoamérica, en el mundo occidental, donde están prohibidas las píldoras anticonceptivas de emergencia.
It's one of the few countries where birth control pills are illegal. They're prohibited.
Promovido por el lobby religioso.
And mainly moved by religious impulses. So there's a lot of work to do.
Yes, there's a lot of work. Definitely.
Yeah.
Estamos bastante mal, mucho asesinato de mujeres.
And-
De los países donde las mujeres son más asesinadas en América Latina. Respecto a las mujeres, la estadística de la situación de las mujeres en Honduras es bastante grave y lamentable.
So Honduras is one of the worst countries for women. There's a lot of deaths, of course, from illegal abortions and that. So they have a huge problem connected to religion, basically.
Yes, yes.
And one final question on this list has got something that the gentleman who can speak English, could he tell us whether there is a constitutional separation between religion and government, or is there religion in the Constitution in Honduras?
Y quiere saber de César que si Honduras tiene, si puede decir, if you can say in English, does Honduras have a strict separation of church and state in the Constitution?
Yes, there is a strict separation of church and state in the Constitution, but just a few weeks ago, several ministers, including the president of the Congress, entered a motion to change the Constitution so that the church, through ministers and different denominations, can participate in the government and hold public positions.
So you're fighting that.
Yes, definitely.
So in paper on the Constitution, it's not a confessional state. It's a secular state on
Yes.
paper.
Yes.
Sí, no es un estado o sea, se define la separación iglesia-estado, pero donde sí es muy clara la Constitución es en la educación. La educación sí está escrito que tiene que ser laica.
So they do have on paper a strict separation of church and state, but when it comes to education, that's given to the church. So that's still a big problem.
So any parting words, Dan?
Well, don't pray for us. We've got plenty of work to do. This is the banana capital of the world.
Oh.
And it's a pretty amazing city. I've never been here before, but it looks like the Hondurans, all by themselves, nobody made them do this. They just on their own wanted to become a free thought group to fight back against religion. So that's really encouraging, I think. And these are wonderful people. These are just two of a bunch of really great people, male and female, that are down here at this conference.
And the conference starts this afternoon, correct?
Today at 3 o'clock. Today at 3.
Well, have a wonderful time.
Yeah, good luck with the conference, and it sounds like the demographics are promising there. A young country is usually a secular country, so good luck.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Say goodbye.
Can he say something?
Oh, yes.
No, yeah.
Parting
Oh,
thoughts? No. Okay,
I think
they're
we've
gone.
lost them.
Let's move on. Okay. Well, we're moving on to the London conference that was held on November 25th. Again, that was the International Conference on Sharia, Segregation and Secularism. It was sponsored by One Law for All and co-sponsored by a number of secular groups, including the Freedom from Religion Foundation. It sounds like it was fascinating. I was watching some of the footage from it. There were speakers from all over the world, most of them women.
Yes, that's right. There were speakers from Poland, Sudan, Pakistan, Tunisia, Bangladesh, India, the United Kingdom, of course, Serbia, Poland, Australia, Canada, Russia, Morocco, Algeria, Dubai, and Iran, and I've probably missed a few.
Wow.
And there did seem to be a focus on women's equality and autonomy, the laws, customs, religious institutions that continue to subjugate and dehumanize women all over the world.
Yep. I was, like I said, watching some of the recorded footage, and I was really happy to hear more than once sort of the theme and the idea that secular government, the separation of religion and government, is an absolute precondition, a bare minimum to gender equality and to achieving equity for women.
Yes, and that was one of the themes of the main organizer, Maryam Namazi. We showed her picture earlier. We had a short clip of her opening remarks, just a couple minutes of about a 6-minute speech, called "Secularism is a Human Right."
So this is really a reflection of this demand for secularism as being a universal one. We're here to defend them. We're here to defend ourselves, our rights, our lives, the right to think and live as we choose, to breathe as we choose, to think as we choose, to dress as we choose, without the constraints of religion. We are here to insist on universal values and on our common humanity, whether we're citizens, whether we're migrants, whether we're believers or non-believers. We also want to insist on secularism as a fundamental and basic human right, and one secular law for all. We're gathered here to challenge the religious right, the far right, to stand up against their hate, their xenophobia, their bigotry. We want to remind them that we are stronger than they are. We are much more than they are. We are the innumerable. And our movement, with many of its leaders sitting right here in this room, we are going to bring that religious right movement to its knees. Thank you, and welcome.
And there were so many women from around the world, feminists and secular activists from Southeast Asia, from the Middle East, and there were some from Eastern Europe. And a standout for me was a Moroccan human rights activist, and I may not pronounce her name correctly, Ibtisami Betty Lashar. And there's her photograph. And we're not going to play that audio since it wasn't the greatest, but I do want to kind of summarize some of the things that she said. She was very quiet. When I met her, we had dinner with her, and I didn't know who she was until she spoke at a panel. And I'm just going to go over some of the things that she told us. She said that she is the first woman in Morocco to say she's an atheist publicly, the first woman to announce she's had premarital sex. She's assumed to be a lesbian. She isn't, but she is an LGBTQ activist. And among the things that they do, she's been called a prostitute. She's been arrested for public drunkenness because in 2014 she took a photograph of herself in front of Parliament with a beer. This is to challenge the law against drinking, and this is kind of a theme of her protests. They have eat-ins during Ramadan where it's not lawful to eat in public during Ramadan.
Wow.
In Morocco. And so she's organized picnics. She tries to break taboos. And she's been beaten several times. She gets rape threats. And then she told us something about the law there. The king is the commander of the faithful, and he has all powers. Islam is the state religion. And the monarch's rights come directly from God. This is the same old story.
Wow.
And abortion is forbidden. But that doesn't mean that there aren't abortions, of course. And they did have that, I forget what it's called, they had that feminist ship come in that performs abortions offshore.
Oh, wow.
She got them in there. So that's just an example
Right.
of the freedom fighters, the level of bravery and courage, because in her country she could face, it was 1 to 6 months in prison just for eating in public during Ramadan.
Wow.
That's just an example of the kind of women that we met at this conference.
It looked like there were a lot of activists living and working or having lived in true theocracies.
Who often don't live there anymore.
Right,
So
they're
many women were
political
from
refugees.
another place and living in Belgium or living in France or living in the Netherlands or living in the UK.
Right. Women who are truly, in political exile, they're living under political asylum in European countries and facing, true theocratic governments against their activism or just their autonomy and just being women in these countries.
But Betty, it's called the abortion boat. I forgot what it's called. Betty is returned to Morocco, to
Wow.
this theocracy to fight for secularism and women's rights. So really courageous.
That's pretty inspirational.
And she was one of the women who, by the way, got this special award, and I don't know if we have a photograph of it. It's a close-up. This is the depiction of, there it is, of the woman who, in January of this year, in Iran, took off her headscarf, her chador, and put it on a flag and waved it around to protest theocracy. And there's the real photograph of her. And I was one of 20 women at that conference who was singled out. I was very undeserving compared to the others, but I got this lovely award created by a woman artist who does all of the awards for One Law for All. So, but Betty really deserved that award.
That is really cool.
So it's in my office now, and I'm very proud of it. And so I think we have some footage also of another standout at the conference, Ina Shevchenko. And she's leader of Feminine, and that's the group that engages in demonstrations, often topless, with their bodies painted, against patriarchy to fight against the control of women's bodies by religion. And she was kidnapped by the KGB in 2011, and when she was able to get free, they gave her political asylum in France. And she inspired the new French stamp issued in 2013 depicting the iconic woman protester from the revolution, French Revolution, Marianne. And we have a short clip of Ina giving a very rousing talk.
Come back to this question of women's bodily autonomy, and generally, why do we have to talk about women's body when we talk about religions? And more generally again, why do we have to talk about women's body every time we talk about women's oppression and discrimination of women? And I'll give you an answer, I'll be brave enough and confident enough. It's because this woman's body has always been a battlefield. It's a battlefield on which religious institutions, religious ideologies stage historical war against women.
What she was talking about is the obsession, the religious and patriarchal obsession with women's bodies and controlling women's bodies. And she was sort of she went through talking about, from head to toe,
Yes.
it's control of women's bodies.
And that's why they go topless with the body painting.
Right.
It's to say that women's bodies are not sinful.
Right.
And
it's controlling our minds, and in so many of these countries, our hair and what's covered and what's uncovered, and how much of our faces can be seen, and
it is an obsession.
Down to our reproductive systems, which we know are a frequent topic of legislative attention and
Religious and governmental ownership.
Right. And so, she was talking about women's bodily autonomy, but also, as just a proxy for women's human rights and just political autonomy. And she was really engaging and really energetic. And so her group, and I think it's Femin, is that the group that you mentioned that does the protests and the body painting, and is really sort of catching fire, and she's become really popular, and gave a really great speech.
And she also got very deservingly one of these unique, one of a kind, well, one of 20 in the world, statuettes. And
Yes,
it's such a wonderful symbol.
She gave a thank you speech, and I just was watching this earlier this morning, and I loved what she said, which is, I'll use this as sort of fuel and motivation to keep whispering in the ears of young girls around the world that, you don't need to be quiet, you don't need to stand down, you don't need to be controlled. So that was a really cool, just so many cool speakers from all over the world doing all kinds of different work in drastically different, political environments, but all sort of around this idea that secularism is a human right, and it's absolutely just essential and urgent for women throughout the world. One of the other things that came up, it seemed like, was a really hot topic and a timely topic at the conference, actually apropos of one of the first episodes of Ask an Atheist that we ever did, where we talked about a question that's always posed to FFRF from the religious right in an effort, of course, to fearmonger and gin up support for the Christian persecution complex. But we always get asked, why doesn't FFRF go after Islam? And of course, we do. And Annie Laurie, it seemed like much of the conference actually was centered around Sharia's influence on laws in other countries, and women who have left Islam and are grappling with that.
Yes, it was predominantly ex-Muslim women. There actually was a Muslim observant woman who was there, who obviously very liberal, and she was highly critical. She's from the UK, highly critical of the idea of Sharia and in support of separation of church and state. And there was an observant Jewish woman, and in fact this conference had been scheduled for Saturday, but she was observant, so we couldn't have it on a Saturday. They accommodated her by holding it on that Sunday so that she could come and speak as well, and also supportive of the separation of church and state. So it was mainly, however, former Muslim women who have really been through the ringer, and some of them, facing life and death situations in making their dissent from the Muslim religion, including Bona Ahmed, who we've been working with, who was the wife of Avajit Roy, and we've had her on, we haven't had her on Ask an Atheist, but she's been on Free Thought Matters, our TV show, in our newspaper, whose husband was hacked to death in Bangladesh in 2015, and she barely survived. But she was there looking very good, and she was also on a panel. There were other women from Bangladesh. A lot of founders of secular groups, which for me is always fun, because I'm a founder of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, and it's really fun to meet the people all around the world who started like-minded groups. And although we get a lot of hate mail and many people telling us to leave the country, we do not face this kind of life and death situation that so many of them face just in coming out as atheists.
It is sobering.
So they're very brave.
It is sobering and inspiring to hear those stories. And Annie Laurie, you were actually a speaker at the conference, and you were on a panel called Secularism as a Defense of Women and Minority Rights. There were women, again, on this panel from many different countries. And we have a clip of some of your remarks on that panel, if we can get it working. Let's take a look.
I'm here today because it's a way to honor the memory of my mother, Anne Gaylor, who was born today, November 25th, 1926. She died 3 years ago, but she was the principal founder of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And I was the co-founder when I was a college student, and today continue with it. And she was a good person for sound bites. She made up sayings like, "Nothing fails like prayer." That you can speculate endlessly about the non-existent. And at the Freedom from Religion Foundation, we use her motto, there can be no religious liberty without the freedom to dissent. In other words, if you don't have freedom from religion in your government, you can't be free. And clearly, if you're a non-believer, you can't be free.
So that was you, and the audio is poor, so if it couldn't be understood, you were opening your remarks by mentioning that the date of the conference, November 25th, was also the birthday of your mother, Ann Gaylor, founder of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, and her, sort of one of her many mottos that was, to paraphrase, there can really be no freedom without the freedom to dissent. And I think that was a really popular sort of concept at the conference. So what was the discussion on that panel about, and what was your perspective?
Well, my perspective was a little different because everybody else on the panel pretty much was springing from a Muslim background or from a Muslim country, although the moderator was a British woman without that background, a journalist. She's very sharp. And so I was the only American there, I think, on any of the panels. There were Americans in the audience. So I pointed out that in the United States, only less than 1% of the population is Muslim right now. So therefore, we aren't seeing the same degree of conflict on Sharia courts that we see in the UK, for example.
Right.
That it might be coming, but most of our problems are with Christian religion and the religious right takeover of our government right now.
Right.
Well, we'll soon have the House back. And, I talked about the problems facing abortion rights with the Kavanaugh appointment, and the fact that here in the state of Wisconsin, we have never been able to get them to take the criminal abortion statutes off the books, as in several other states, so that if they were ever to throw it back to states' rights issue, here we are.
Yeah,
and
part of it, that's something I think that is somewhat unique in the American sort of political scheme, which is federalism, and how the tension between states' rights and the federal government impacts the ways in which women's rights can be curtailed.
Yeah, they were curious about the state versus federal issues, which goes right with the one law for all. I was pointing out, if it's a human right, it shouldn't matter. It can't matter what state you live in.
Right.
Obviously, reproductive rights can't be dependent on a state. You can't cross the border and suddenly have a human right you didn't have before.
Right.
I mean, it's just like the slavery issue. And I pointed out, I gave them a little bit of a primer about the states' rights background, which was the slavers and the anti-segregationists always trumpeting states' rights. And now that's what we're getting with religion on gay rights and women's rights and abortion rights.
Right.
And I also touched briefly on something that we haven't talked yet since I came back with the legal staff about a decision that came down as we were flying to London. I think it was on the 27th, that a federal court in Michigan invalidated a congressional law that banned genital mutilation. And I haven't even read that yet.
Right.
I hadn't read it as I spoke, but I said this kind of shows the conflict. How can they say that in some states you can mutilate girls' genitals for religious reasons, and in other states you can't?
Right.
Obviously, this is a human right to be free from mutilation. So we are seeing some of this, the Muslim tension in the law here in this country.
And I think the United States, by way of federalism, is sort of a microcosm for the international problem of boundaryless human rights. I mean, there are countries who are fighting for basic human rights that are considered, absolutely fundamental in first world countries, some Western countries, and not others. And women are just living, and minorities, in vastly different circumstances when it comes to basic human rights. And that can be, there can be sort of a similar lack of cohesion from state to state in our country, which is, a shame. And
that's a big threat. Well, and speaking of lack of human rights, I think you wanted to talk about a situation in Pakistan.
Yes. So a few weeks ago, I was actually on Ask an Atheist talking about blasphemy laws with the Irish referendum. And it sounds like there was a lot of discussion and alarm about, at this London conference, around blasphemy prosecutions, particularly with the recent prosecution of Asia Bibi in Pakistan, which she's a Christian woman in Pakistan who was prosecuted for blasphemy. So who spoke about this issue at the conference, and what were the discussions?
Yes, I've got this in the teleprompter because I want to get his name right. The keynote address was the only major keynote address by a man. It was made by Shaif ul Maluk, and he was the attorney who defended Asia Bibi throughout the whole appeal process. And we were at a hotel having breakfast the day of the conference, and there was a distinguished-looking man sitting at the table next to us. And then another man came over who identified himself as Norwegian to him and asked, "Where is the conference?" And so when we realized, oh, you're going to the conference, I said something to him. Then I found out it was the attorney who got her off. I shook his hand immediately. He was very warm. So he gave the opening remarks, and they were kind of brief, but this was a terrible process because the prime minister, it was, I believe, who defended her, ended up getting assassinated by his bodyguard.
Right.
And then there's a huge hue and cry to let that bodyguard go. I mean, the sentiment in Pakistan is frightening.
It is.
And so he talked a little bit about there were a lot of different countries that are working to see if they can get her out of Pakistan because they don't believe she'll be safe. But what a brave man.
Right.
He's taken his life, he's in danger. And he wanted to be sure that she was represented. And he spoke about how she was illiterate. She's a peasant worker on a farm. And somebody just said they supposedly saw her burning, a Quran. It was kind of like the
Right.
Salem witch trial
Right.
stuff in our country, in our nation, or before we were a nation. So it was such a miscarriage of justice, and so great that he got her off, but still such a precarious situation in Pakistan.
Frightening.
So
And everyone involved under horrific threats of violence, and not just threats in some cases. The judges deciding that case were
Yes.
receiving threats of violence,
right.
the attorneys.
Everybody.
I'm sure the man who spoke had some horrifying stories. And everybody just at great risk to themselves.
And he was so gracious, he ended his remarks by saying, I want to do anything I can to help, one law for all.
Wow.
So, yes, thrilling.
Was
to meet
he
him.
Pakistani?
Mm-hmm, I believe.
Wow. Really inspirational and just courageous people, and that must have been
a thrilling moment to accidentally meet him.
such a great experience. Well, I'm going to shift. I'm going to shift now and see if we're getting any questions from the Facebook universe here. Sorry. Here we go. So, today's questions, December 5th. Here we go. Okay. So here's a question for you, Annie Lorian. I'm sure you've actually, unfortunately, thought a lot about this. From Germinter, do you ever worry about violence occurring when you attend conferences like these?
We were a co-sponsor, and I assume some of our co-sponsorship was for protection. When we co-sponsored the conference a year and a half ago, which was one of the largest ex-Muslim groupings in the world. It was about 200 people there, many of them speaking. I know that our help went for protection, and Miriam is very careful. She doesn't give out the venue until right before the conference. And every time we came in, we were screened and our bags were looked at. So I really wasn't too worried about it. But of course, in this country, I feel that anywhere you are is risky because of our lack of gun control.
Right.
They have much more gun control in that country. But I was told by the British humanists, and we went to see their office, and they have a little bit of security, that when they had a live, the police came in for some live action training. It wasn't about guns, it was about knives.
Wow.
So anywhere you go, you can run into problems.
No, I mean, unfortunately, this is something that's kind of in the back of our minds, often at our own conferences.
But this is not, when you think about churches that get together, they don't need this kind of protection in London to meet with like-minded people. I mean, it really is, it shows the second-class status. It shows how the religious dogma has created so much violence, this hatred against apostates.
Yeah.
And they are the most at risk. Somebody who is born in a Muslim country, who's born Muslim, who leaves,
Right.
who becomes an apostate, is in special danger because they knew the right way to go and then they left it.
Right.
They're in more danger than the typical Christian, as that Pakistani Christian woman was sort of an aberration where they were charging her with blasphemy.
Right. Wow. Okay, it looks like we've only got one more question here, but it's kind of got two parts. So, this is a little bit of a hostile question, but we'll take it. Isn't the biggest problem with religion in the UK right now happening because of the flood of Muslim immigrants? Shouldn't America worry about the same thing happening here? You know, what do we think about that in terms of the problems that the UK and European countries are having with their Muslim communities?
Well, I think the acts of violence are by Islamic terrorists that we've seen in the UK, in Manchester, in 7/7. But I think the problem in the UK is fundamentally because there isn't a separation of religion and government. And they allow religious instruction in the public schools, and that religious instruction is Anglican. And so they have been lobbied to say we should have separate schools because we're not Anglican for our children. And so we have taxpayer support of Muslim schools and religiously segregated schools in the UK. And this is something that Richard Dawkins has talked about a lot, for example. The very dangerous to go down that route. And so the seeds for the problems, I think, in the UK were planted or are planted because there is not that separation of religion and government. And now they are supposedly accommodating other religions. Very bad idea. And they should disestablish the church and have secular schools and not ever feel that they need to support Sharia schools or religiously segregated schools for anyone.
Right.
And so I think that separating the terrorism is quite separate from the state church issues.
Right. There's violence, you know, depending on what you mean by the biggest problem. You know, there's violence, and then there's just religious pluralism and how involved can or should the state be in you know, religion, individual religious choice.
And of course, if you look at the history of terrorism in the UK, it was Catholic versus Protestant. So again, stemming from the lack of separation, the fact that some people were more equal than others, that the second-class status of Catholics in Northern Ireland, for example. You know, we've seen all kinds of religious violence in the UK that was not initiated originally from the Muslim religion. You can get it in any religion.
Right, right. And again, I mean, it just kind of brings back to one of the themes of the conference, which is that secular government is really sort of a baseline necessity for
human rights,
making sure that minority rights are protected, whatever the minority might be, as immigration patterns change. You know, you want minority rights protected because demographics are changing and, you know, the world is getting smaller. But if you have a secular democracy that protects human rights and minority
and doesn't
rights.
fund religion.
Right, right. And secular education and a completely secular government. That's kind of the special sauce. So
Yes.
well, thank
Was that
you.
a two-part, did you say?
Yes. Well, the second part was, shouldn't America worry about the same
Oh, I
thing
see.
happening here, which I think is a question about immigration and changing demographics, a growing Muslim community, although I think our Muslim population is very small compared to...
Well, yeah, and just to address it, however, we did do an amicus brief against the Muslim ban.
the Trump travel ban.
And, you know, of all the countries in the world that have created problems of terrorism, in 9/11 and now in Yemen, Saudi Arabia, hey, it's not on the ban. So,
Right.
you know, we could talk about that, but we, you know, our buttressing of Saudi Arabia and this absolutely atrocious and inhumane war, unnecessary war in Yemen, which is now where it's the famine hotspot, the cholera hotspot, you name it, the suffering that is going on, partly by U.S. weapons being sold to Saudi Arabia, and our president is very proud to trumpet that, as is Reverend Pat Robertson.
Mm-hmm.
This is the reason why we need to keep open relations so we can sell our arms to another country. If we want to look at problematic Muslim nations, let's look at Saudi Arabia and maybe cut off those ties.
Right. Work to be done. Well, thank you so much for talking with us about the conference in London and all of our international goings on in the past couple of weeks. And thank you for watching. I want to mention, if you'd like to take action on issues involving religion and government that are happening in your area, please sign up to receive FFRF text alerts on your smartphone. You can text FFRF to 52886. Of course, data rates may apply. Again, that's FFRF to 52886. These show up on YouTube, these episodes of Ask an Atheist. You can see them on YouTube afterwards, so please pass the word on to friends. We have more than a year's worth of shows available up on YouTube, so check us out there. And thank you again for joining us on this week's Ask an Atheist.